Let's see, it is, yeah, it's 4 o'clock. Hello, everyone. I think we'll still have some people coming in as we start, but it's 4 o'clock, so we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited for this talk, Invasive Weed Identification Reporting. Brad Mead will be giving this presentation. This event is a co-presentation by NatureScaping of Southwest Washington and the Camas Public Library. I'm just going to give a couple housekeeping items before we get started, and then I'm going to turn it over to Marlene of NatureScaping of Southwest Washington. Right now, I just want to let people know that there's a document that's going to be important for this presentation, and I'm going to put it in the chat right now. It's a link to a document, and it is a list of invasive weed plants. And so you can reference that during this presentation, and Brad will be talking about it, and there'll even be a chance to kind of request species to talk about. So just put that in the chat right now. So I encourage everyone to click on that link and have that document available. I also want to let everyone know that this is being recorded. So what we're going to do is send out a follow-up email after the event is over to everyone who's registered, and it'll contain a link to this recording. It's going to live on the YouTube page of the Camas Public Library. So be on the lookout for that. I also want to let you know that the chat is open right now. And so if you have questions, you can type them in the chat. I'll be kind of hopping on to help moderate those questions. But I want to point that out that the questions will happen in the chat and it'll be available during the presentation. So I think that's it for me. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Marlene before Brad takes over. So it's all yours, Marlene.
Hello, everybody. You can't see me, but hopefully you can hear me. I am the administrative assistant for NatureScaping, which is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. And we maintain the wildlife botanical gardens in Brush Prairie. I hope all of you have been there or are aware of them. If not, please go to our website, naturescaping.org, and check us out and see where the gardens are. They're beautiful this time of year. Everything's blooming despite all the heat we've had. They're still looking really good, and I hope you can enjoy the gardens. Normally our classes were held in person once a month. Our classes are a benefit of membership, but since the pandemic and subsequent, it's still being held on Zoom for the most part. And so we do graciously ask for any donations that you may want to contribute to us. And we would really appreciate that. You can, again, go to naturescaping.org and see where to send those. So anyway, without further ado, because we have a big show for you today, I would love to announce Brad Mead. He is going to talk about invasive species, and he will tell you all about himself. He could do a much better job than I can. So I hope you enjoy this. I hope this is interesting. We all have weeds. I'm sure that I know I walk around my yard and sometimes I don't know if that's a weed or a plant that volunteered itself in my landscape. So hopefully we'll find that out today. So without further ado, take it away, Brad. And thank you very much for doing this for us.
Of course. I want to thank everybody for taking time out of their schedules to learn a bit about invasive species ID and specifically weeds within Clark County. As Marlene said, I'm Brad Mead. I'm with the Clark Public Utilities. I'm the invasive species coordinator. I typically coordinate them by color and size. But what we do at the utility is primarily go after invasive riparian species, so plants that are not from this area, cause either economic or environmental damage, and grow along streams or waterways. and we primarily work in Salmon Creek and East Fork watersheds. And usually it's Japanese knotweed's the big one, and we've had a lot of success in controlling it. But unfortunately, it's a long-term project, so we'll be doing that for quite a while. But just a quick little background on me. I have a Bachelor of Science from Oregon State University for botany, and then a minor in forest management. And I've worked with the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and Tillamook Soil and Water Conservation District. So I've done a lot of jobs in the public sector doing invasive species control and some restoration work. So that's where I'm coming from. And today, if you look at that list that we shared through the chat, that species list has a bunch of different species that are either in Clark County now or in neighboring areas that could come into Clark County. And I'd be happy to talk about any of them. I know it's a big list and there's a lot to digest, but if any of them sound familiar, or if you can look up some pictures and they look familiar and it's something you want to know about, just put it into chat and we'll go over them, because there is no way that we're going to be able to make it through the full list today. There's just too many species and too much to cover. So with that, let's get this show on the road. Do we have a species that has been selected yet, or should I go off of the first one on the list? Let's see here.
So far, no one has posted anything in the chat.
All right, well then we're going with number one on the list, which I believe is pokeweed, if it will let me advance. There we go.
Actually, we did just get a request for blackberry is the first one, and then yellow flag iris.
Let's see here if I can get, do we have Himalayan Blackberry? I might not have it in this list. I do not have Himalayan Blackberry in here because it's so pervasive and common. I can speak to it a little bit though. So there are, so blackberries are in the genus Rubus, or Rubus rather, and it's either called Himalayan blackberry or Armenian blackberry, and they're incredibly common in Clark County, and they are usually choking out stream banks and preventing a lot of other plants from growing along them. And the best way to identify them, because I mean, they're pretty easy to identify, right? Because you have those canes that have the thorns on them and they make blackberries. But there's actually a number of different rubus in our area, and the best way to identify them is that they have their leaves are in 5 parts. So if you see the 5 leaves all together there, then you know that you're looking at a Himalayan blackberry. And that's an invasive species that if you can control it, you should. It's quite the job though, depending on how much you have. So I can't blame you if you have some on your property. Another lookalike, well, I shouldn't say lookalike, but another invasive blackberry that we have is called cutleaf or evergreen blackberry. And it's similar in that it has the typical blackberry characteristics of the thorny vines. The leaves are usually a darker color, and the name cutleaf gives you an idea of how to identify them, and that the leaves are deeply incised, so you're going to see really deep cuts in them, and they look very jagged and sharp. They look quite dangerous on their own, and those are also invasive, but they're far less common than the Himalayan blackberries that are ubiquitous within the county. So was that next one yellow flag iris?
Yep, next one was yellow flag iris, and there's a more posts in the chat now. So that's the next one.
All right, so yellow flag iris is a beautiful plant. I will probably be saying this a lot. I am a bit of a plant nerd, so I do respect even the invasive plants in some regards. And oftentimes that's how invasive species get started, is through the horticulture trade. So I always caution people to avoid buying plants that are exotic or from places other than locally. So if you can get native plants, I highly recommend them. They are usually a lot easier to care for, the better for the environment, because they provide a lot of resources to our native wildlife. And you don't have to worry about them being an invasive threat and escaping your property and going to cause havoc elsewhere. So yellow flag iris is super easy to identify. I know there's a lot of irises that are grown horticulturally, and there's also native irises. Our native irises are quite small. They typically will get at most 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet tall, and they usually have just the kind of the purpley blue flowers, but they're very small and they're not nearly as robust and showy as the bearded irises that you typically see in garden plantings. For the yellow flag irises, as the name implies, they have yellow flowers. And if you see an iris and it has a yellow flower, or just see an iris blade, and if you're not familiar with what an iris blade looks like, the leaves usually fan out, and they're kind of just they just splay out like a fan. And if you see that, you're almost guaranteed to be looking at an iris. And if you do happen to see the flowers, then you know for sure that it is yellow flag. But if it's growing along a waterway or a pond, it's almost 100% going to be yellow flag iris. And these plants are very difficult to control, primarily because they have these storage roots that if you were trying to dig them up, it's really easy to break them and they fragment off, and then you can actually end up causing them to spread further. So if you are doing that, you need to make sure that you're doing something to control those fragments, usually with some type of netting, especially if you're in stream doing this, to get those before they go downstream. And I guess the other thing of note with these, let's go down here, is that they have seeds that float, and they are not only are they prolific seeders, but their seeds will germinate with almost, I mean, it's 99% seed viability, which is pretty unusual. And it's the main way that these plants spread. And they're typically not super problematic where you see them commonly around ponds and waterways, because they're not really super prolific. Ponds, yes, they can be an issue, but in estuaries and in where rivers come together with other water bodies, they can really go crazy and take over those whole areas, and that's where they are problematic. So what was the next species on the list?
The next is Scotch Broom.
Oh, that's a fun one. I'm not sure if I have Scotch Broom, but I have its more horrible cousin, and we can talk about both in one go. Maybe I do. I have Scotch Thistle. All right, we're gonna go to this one. So Scotch Broom and Gorse are very similar looking. They're actually not as closely related as you might suspect. They are both interesting in that they are shrubs that photosynthesize on their stems. So they have those green stems, and they can actually generate food from their stems, which is semi-unusual in the plant world. They're in the pea family, so they have those lovely pea flowers. Let me see if I can get that pointer up here. I can't quite figure that one out, but anyways, so they have that pea flower. It's very distinctive. And one of the things that makes Scotch Broom and Gorse so hard to control is that their seeds are so long-lived in the environment. Some studies have shown that the seeds can remain viable in the soil for 70 years or longer. So if they are allowed to set seed, you are basically stuck with these plants, which is really unfortunate. Of course, the main difference between Scotch Broom and Gorse is that Gorse is what they call armed in the botany world, and that just basically means that it's pokey. I won't get into all the spines and thorns and armed chicanery with the botany terms, but needless to say, Gorse is basically just the horrible cousin to Scotch Broom and will poke you most unmercifully if you try to remove them. And the best way to remove these is there's a tool called a weed wrench. And basically what it is it's a vice grip on the bottom, and then it has this really long arm that you can use to lever, and the vise will then latch on to the base of the plant, and then if you just have to yard on it and it will pull it right out of the ground. And if you have a lot of these and you're wanting to control them on your property, that is my recommendation. These plants are pretty resistant to herbicides, and while they can work on them, I have seen places where herbicides were applied to Scotch Broom and Gorse, and the plants continued. The places that were treated were dead, but they just continued growing off of the dead portion and persisted. So I think manual control or mechanical control makes the most sense for these. If you have a really old decadent stand of Scotch Broom, you can also cut down the stems, and they typically won't regrow from that, but you will have to contend with the seedlings that will surely come up in their wake. So this is one of those plants that unfortunately, if you have it on your property, you're probably going to have to live with it. But if you're super dedicated and you can get your your children involved, you might be able to have a multi-generational effort to control and eradicate a population on your property. It's definitely possible. It's just challenging. And I think that's about it for Gorse and Scotch Broom. Do we have another species?
Yeah, they keep coming in, and we've got actually a few people have requested thistle, and then there was a follow-up question for the iris, which is our most iris invasive?
So no, only for the iris, only the yellow flag iris that I'm aware of is considered invasive. So if you want to go out to the garden store and get those bearded irises that are very showy and dramatic, they're not going to spread and cause problems. I've never heard of that being a thing. I would still always recommend getting the natives. They typically provide more resources to pollinators and to other organisms as well, like caterpillars. Which I know can sound like, whoa, that's a pest, but they end up providing a lot of resources to birds, and a lot of our native bird species require caterpillars to be able to raise their chicks. So it's a balancing act, and I always err on the side of planting natives if it's for a visual purpose, because we have a lot of gorgeous native plants to choose from. And it sounds like we're ready to go down the thistle rabbit hole. And I've chosen some of the more uncommon thistle varieties. There are many, many, many thistle species out there, including some native ones that are unfortunately not particularly common. But we will go into the thistle game here. See here where we got the thistles, starting with Musk Thistle. So Thistle ID can be challenging. Differentiating them is definitely difficult because they have some characteristics that are very similar to each other. And even though they're not all in the same genus, they have the same typically spiky leaves, and they have that poofy flower head with the typically spiky bracts underneath that make it pretty challenging to tell them apart. I will do my best to help with this identification, but I am by no means a thistle expert, and I don't encounter a lot of the species that we're going to talk about with any regularity. When I usually have seen these when I've been traveling, and I have to pull over to check them out because I get all excited about them, which I know is silly because I'm sure the people that are out there dealing with these day in and day out are completely just exacerbated seeing all these because there's so many. And they're mostly problematic in meadow habitats or in pasture lands because they love disturbed ground, and they just blow around with seed, or some of them will spread underground through their roots. So musk thistles, I don't believe we have musk thistles in Clark County. If we do, they're not particularly common. But that makes it even more important to keep an eye out for them, because if we can get on top of them before they come into the area, we're going to have a much better chance of eradicating them before they spread and get out of control. So musk thistle, the big thing that I understand as far as differentiating them is looking at this characteristic right here. A lot of the flowering heads have this nodding, this angle where it's almost 90 degrees, where it's just it's drooping a bit. Which is a bit unusual. Most thistles, their flower stems are pretty erect. The other thing to note is that they have this kind of uniform, and this is not technical in any way, but it's almost like kind of a poofy flower structure to it. Whereas a lot of the other thistles, it almost looks spiky with the way that the flowers are arranged, and you'll see that on some of the other species that we'll talk about. But going forward here, you can just see that the flower heads are kind of uniform, and you can see this really dramatic, the nodding characteristic of the flowers here, which is what I would point people towards. The other thing of note is if you look on the margins of the leaves, they almost kind of have a silvery look to them. And that's another good diagnostic characteristic for a musk thistle. And that's just because of the hairs that are along the leaf margins. Now we're going to move on to Plumeless Thistle, which I do believe we have a few populations, at least in Clark County. I've not personally encountered it, but I know that the county has, and the folks that deal with the weeds with the county, and they've said that they've encountered some Plumeless Thistle. So it's something to be aware of. These ones can get quite tall, 2 meters tall, or over 6 feet if you want to use yield English measurements. The rosettes for the leaves, so those are, do we have a good, yeah, so this is a rosette here. If you're not familiar with the term, think of a dandelion, how when it first comes up, it puts out that ring of leaves. That is a rosette, and that's purpose is to shade out any plants that are immediately around the thistle in this case. And it's a really good competitive strategy, and it allows it to compete with grasses because they're trying to come up too. This basically creates an umbrella around them and starves them out for the light resources that they need. So the plumeless thistles they have really thin, kind of delicate leaves. As you can see it really dramatically here, they just have these really kind of dinky looking leaves. And then if you go forward again, You can see that unlike the musk thistle, the flowers aren't quite as uniform, and they definitely kind of poke out more. And those are the two characteristics I'd point people towards to get them towards the plumeless thistle versus another thistle species. And those are the two big thistles that are outside of the norm. Of course, we also have things like Canada thistle, which is probably the most prolific thistle that you'll see in our area. And that one is kind of unique among the thistles in that it spreads through its roots, which is makes it very difficult to control. Because most thistles, you can just pop them out of the ground with a pickaxe or a shovel, and it's not that big of a deal. But Canada thistle, you're probably wanting to use an herbicide to control those, just because of that root system is going to give them a lot more ability to survive mechanical means, because the roots will just, you'll be breaking them up, and then you'll have a bunch of new ones popping up. And that's in addition to them spreading through their windborne seeds. So they're definitely something that's good to get on top of. Now we're moving on to purple star thistle. I don't believe we have purple star thistle in our area, but it's something to keep a lookout for, because they are horrible plants to deal with. While the other thistles are definitely pokey, these ones are incredibly painful in my experience. I've pulled many by hand, even with gloves. Those thorns will go right through your glove, and I swear it's more painful than it should be. So I'm wondering if there's some type of stinging mechanism going on, or if they have something on their thorns, because they definitely hurt when they stab you. These ones are, I'd say, the most unique characteristic. They're quite short typically, although if they're in a good environment, they can get to over a meter tall. Although it's not as common to see that. They have kind of a grayish blue hue to the leaves, and that's because they have hairs on them. And usually when you see a plant that has that kind of coloration, if you look closely at the leaves, you'll see a bunch of little tiny hairs on there. And that's what gives them that kind of cast or hue. And that's typically an adaptation either for preventing herbivory, so something making them less palatable for predators, or something to keep the sun from just blister, because a lot of places that they grow are in open areas, and plants cannot handle being inundated with too much sun. So these hairs will actually refract and reflect light away from the plant, so it helps them persist in those environments and outcompete other plants. I got anything else here? It says that they're toxic to livestock here, but I don't think livestock would even try eating them just because they would be getting stabbed constantly. Although I haven't talked to any cows to verify that the unpleasantness of eating thistles, so I could be totally mistaken. Oh, sorry about that. My sound went off there. Can you hear me still?
Yeah, we can hear you, Brad.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
So as you can see here, the leaves are a lot smaller on the purple star thistle, and which is pretty similar to the yellow, and that they're much more tiny plants, and that's because they have an annual lifestyle, so they pretty much pop up and they do their whole life cycle within a year, and then they die. Moving on to Scotch thistle. Now, these are one of my favorite invasive thistles, which is probably silly to say, but mostly the first time I saw them, I was freaking out because I have never seen a thistle this huge before. So right at the top, as you can see, they get 3 meters tall, which is ridiculous for a thistle, in my opinion. Anyways, they are really large as far as thistles go, and if you just see a really huge thistle, chances are you're looking at Scotch thistle. I remember when I went out to Wyoming for a vacation / road trip / botany adventure. uh, I could not believe the Scotch thistle out there. It was just mind blowing how huge these plants could get in areas that were so arid and otherwise. I mean, pretty much you're saying sagebrush and not a whole lot else in these environments, but they're very well suited for these places. They have those really fine hairs to help them handle the constant sun exposure and the heat. Um, let's move on to some more pictures here just so you can get an idea. Another thing that's pretty diagnostic in my experience as the flowers age, this base here, the green base of the flower, they always look smushed to me. And whenever I saw that, I was like, wow, that's kind of strange. And that's a good way to identify these, along with the just crazy amount of hairs that you see on the leaves. And there's just so much. They're just really furry and typically quite large, although the height is quite variable. So the 3 meters 10-foot tall Scotch thistles aren't the norm, but they can happen. I think the tallest thistle I've ever seen was a native thistle that was growing in the shade on a side of a road that managed to, it must have been 12 feet tall because my coworker was 6 feet tall, and we took a picture and it was over twice the height of my coworker. It was pretty astounding. So thistles can get quite massive in the right conditions. I think that's it for those. Yellow star thistle. These are also horrible. The brother to the purple star thistle. These ones are incredibly nasty. I believe they also have toxins in their leaves. So in addition to being very spiky and pokey, they are just poisonous to boot. I remember that we had to wear gloves while pulling these because they were toxic, which is kind of silly because why wouldn't you wear gloves anyways? But that's where we were at. They have that same kind of grayish blue hue on the leaves, and that's just those really fine hairs because they often grow in really dry and exposed areas. These ones can get up to 2 meters tall, although the height difference between different individuals is huge. They can get very small. I've seen them growing 2 or 3 inches high and flowering. And I've also seen them getting up to the 2 meter plus mark. They are quite variable in that regard. There isn't a whole lot of yellow flowered pokey plants running around, so they're quite distinctive. And it's my understanding that these plants were brought in specifically for use for honey. And I'm a little worried about that because if the plants produce toxins in their leaves, it's possible they also have some toxins in the flowers. And they might not affect the bees necessarily, but they might be in the honey. So I would be hesitant to get too deep into the yellow star thistle honey, but your mileage may vary on that one. Just some more pictures here. They do look quite different when they're young. Those rosettes aren't nearly as intimidating, but they quickly grow out into this grotesque monster that you see here. And I do not recommend them at all. So that's it for the thistles. Do we have another species lined up?
Yeah, actually, we have a few follow-up questions and then some more species. I'll just mention this first follow-up question because it's about thistles, and it's, are there any thistles that are considered good?
Yeah, so there are a few native thistles in our area. and it's really difficult to give specifics on the identification because A, they're not very common. B, oftentimes they're very similar looking to the invasive thistles, which is always why I hesitate to get people to go out and just obliterate every thistle that they see, which is often kind of the default. We don't have that many of the natives in our area, but I do see them from time to time. And my only recommendation is to take care that you understand which species you're dealing with. And if you're not entirely sure it's best to probably leave them be for the time being until you can get a firm identification. And if you're wanting some help with that, I recommend, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but the EdMaps app that you can get on your phone, you can actually go on there, take a picture, and report an invasive species sighting. You can just say thistle, and some professionals will then get that report, and they'll be able to actually identify that for you, and that'll get you at least going in the right direction there. Or they'll say, hey, this is one of the natives, so you don't have to worry about it. Typically, the natives don't grow in the same level of craziness that the invasives do, and you only see them kind of sporadically. They don't really have these huge patches like you do with the invasives, and that's just a byproduct of the ecological balance that isn't there for the invasives, because the natives have to deal with a lot of pressure from pathogens and predators that have basically co-evolved with our native thistles, which really limits their ability to spread and go out of control, whereas the invasives don't have those same pressures because they're so new to the area that they don't have the predators and they don't have the pathogens attacking them, so they're able to outcompete, in a sense, our native species. And you said there was another question regarding thistles?
Actually, there's a few questions, follow-up questions for Scotch Broom.
Oh, great.
I'll just ask all three. One is, do goats eat Scotch Broom? One is to restate the tool that you mentioned that might help with Scotch Broom. And another is, why doesn't the state control Scotch Broom?
Okay. Well, we'll start with the goat question. So I have heard of people using goats to control Scotch Broom. My understanding is that they will eat it technically, but it's not something that they prefer. There's not a whole lot of good leaf mass on Scotch Broom, and I wouldn't recommend goats as an effective control for Scotch Broom. I know that Scotch Broom also does produce alkaloids that I don't know if they would be toxic to goats necessarily, but it's not, I wouldn't recommend it as a control strategy. Uh, the thing I would recommend, the tool is called a weed wrench. I believe that there's other, I can't really recommend a particular brand per se, and I think that the company that made them stopped making them, and then another company picked up the banner, and there's other, I know that there's some other tools out there, but if you just, I think if you punch in to Google Scotch Broom weed wrench, you'll probably come up with a number of results that'll get you pointed in the right direction. The ones that I'm familiar with are just bright orange, like construction orange, and there's, I mean, it's just like a lever with a vise at the bottom of it, and it typically has a little platform on the bottom there to give it a little bit more leverage. And if you see one of those, those are the ones I would recommend. They come in different sizes based on how large your Scotch Broom is. Another option for Scotch Broom control, if you have a field of it and you're feeling a little cheeky, I have used a come along before, and I'd wrap the chain around the biggest Scotch broom I could find, and then I'd wrap the chain around another Scotch broom, and then you just keep levering it until one of them pops out of the ground, and then they just do battle with each other until there's the one true Scotch broom, and then that one you're gonna have to figure out how to deal with, although it's probably impossible to deal with it if it's that powerful. And that's a kind of a fun way to take care of them, and it worked pretty well for us, but it is a slow process, and it's something you have to be really dedicated to see any level of success. And the last one, why the state doesn't control Scotch broom, it all comes down to picking your battles with invasive species. Scotch broom is so incredibly pervasive on the landscape, and that 70-year seed bank is just absolutely killer for being able to control them with any sort of level of effectiveness. A lot of state and county and just local land management organizations don't have the capacity to go out and control every population of invasive species on their lands. So they have to prioritize, and typically that's going to be the top tier species that are problematic. So the class A's and some of the class B noxious weeds. I guess I haven't talked about this yet. We'll go over it real quick. There's a legal designation for invasive species called noxious weeds, and those are typically set by the weed regulator for your area. In Clark County, that is just Clark County Vegetation Management. They have 3 levels of noxious weeds. There's the class A's, and if you have a class A on your property, you are required to control that. And the county will control any class A on their lands as well, and they sometimes can offer assistance to landowners if it's a specialized tool usage that's required or something along those lines, but typically the landowner is responsible for those. And then for the class B, those ones are kind of split. And they're not the highest priority, but a lot of them still are required for control, but not all of them are. And these are just priority levels for trying to group species together based on how problematic they are and how likely it is that you could actually eradicate or at least control a population. And then class C are either species that aren't very common, they don't spread very much, or they're incredibly common to the point where they're basically ubiquitous, and control efforts are really limited to a particular landscape or area. So a good example of this is Himalayan blackberries. They are considered a class C because they are absolutely everywhere, and it is completely unreasonable to expect to be able to eradicate them from the landscape because of all the different ways that they can spread and their ability to resist mechanical damage. That's basically how it goes. It's definitely, I know it can be frustrating when you see Scotch broom out on public lands, and I guarantee that if the land managers had the resources, they would go after those with reckless abandon. But there's only so much that they're able to do, and the Scotch broom with the 70-year seed bank, it just falls lower on the list because it's considered to be a lost cause. So if you have some on your property, but it's not several acres of it, it's definitely possible to control. And I find that using the weed wrench or digging them up is really effective because it stimulates the seed bank, because the seeds love that disturbance, and you'll have a bunch of little babies come up, and you can just pop those out of the ground, and you're going to see a huge drop off in the number that are coming up year over year. But you still will be seeing them coming up for a long time, and it'll keep getting less and less as you go, but there's always the possibility that they're going to come up any given year, and they produce so many tiny little seeds that it's a really difficult thing to get under control. So it's an unfortunate situation, but it's one that we pretty much have to live with or spend a ridiculous amount of time and resources to control. Were there any other questions?
That looks like, yeah, follow-up questions for the topics you just spoke about. The next species is Tanzi Ragwort.
All right, let's see. I don't know. I think I might have that in here. Let's find out. Well, I don't have Tansy in my list, but I can talk about it a bit because I know it is quite common. I tried to leave off the more common species, which might have been a bit of a mistake, but we can talk about it nonetheless. So Tansy is an interesting case. Back in the 70s, there was a huge explosion of Tansy all over Western Oregon, Western Washington, just west of the Cascades. It was highly unusual, and it was really problematic for a lot of ag producers because these plants are incredibly toxic to livestock. And they are blown around by seeds. So if your neighbor has it, it's only a matter of time before it makes it onto your property, and it just really can get out of control quickly. And after that time, there's been a lot of efforts to get people to control it on their properties. And a lot of that ties to just ag producers and people that are raising animals on their lands don't want it on their land. And they put pressure on local regulatory agencies to get people to control their tansy. And that's where it really originated. We do have some tansy. There was a bit of a resurgence in the last 4 or 5 years with large amounts of tansy coming back. But it's been kept at bay at least somewhat because there's there's a couple biocontrols that have been released for them that have been at least fairly successful at keeping them from being quite as crazy as they normally are. So if you see those orange and black caterpillars on the tansy, then you know that those tansy are going to have a hard time spreading. And those caterpillars need those food resources to live and breed and survive. So typically people are recommended if they see those caterpillars to not go after those particular plants. But I know that sometimes you're required to control them. And if that's the case for you, then disregard that and just pull them out of the ground. Just make sure you wear gloves, and I would wash any of the gear that you use when handling those plants because they are quite toxic. And if you're not sure what tansy looks like, I will try to describe it to the best of my ability. They have small little poofy yellow flowers and dark green kind of wavy leaves. And they're in the dandelion family or the aster family, if you know what that is. So they have those composite flower heads, and they're ubiquitous. Pretty much anywhere that you go on the West Coast, you're going to find tansy. It's a really common weed, and it's an unfortunate problem in pastures and for people who are raising livestock. I hope that addressed the tansy sufficiently. But if you have any other questions about tansy that I didn't address, please just drop it into the chat, and I will try to address it more thoroughly. But I think I'm ready for the next species.
Okay. The next species is English ivy.
English ivy. I think that's another one I don't have on here. I really should have just gotten all the good ones out of the way, but let's see. That would be E. It's not in here. We're going to talk about ivy anyways. You all know what ivy looks like. Who doesn't know what ivy looks like? It's got those star-shaped leaves, super leathery leaf surface, and it spreads like crazy. To control ivy, there's a number of ways to do it. Herbicides are pretty much out the window because of that thick, waxy cuticle in the leaves. It is possible, but you have to use a ridiculous amount. And I think that the manual control methods are just better in general. And I typically urge the use of manual methods whenever possible, just because it's typically better for the environment. So let's say you have a tree, and this is where ivy really becomes problematic, is when ivy grows up a tree, it can actually kill it. And there is a misconception that the ivy is killing it because it's tapping into the vasculature or the xylem of the plants and drinking up water and nutrients from the plants that they're growing on. They are not doing that. They are just using them as a substrate to grow on. And the reason why they kill plants is because they add so much weight that it makes the trees really prone to being wind thrown. So in a windstorm, if you have double or triple the weight that a tree normally would have, it hasn't had enough time to build up the necessary structural components within its wood to resist the mechanical stresses that are being put on it, and it's much more likely to get overtopped. And to make matters worse, oftentimes ivy will eventually spread out into the branches and start covering all of the leaves and starve out the trees that way. So they're definitely problematic. And if you have it on your trees, they're actually pretty easy to control. All you have to do is if you take some loppers or snippers, depending on how, or sometimes even a handsaw when they get really, really big, which I've had to do that on my property a couple of times. All you have to do is cut around just a circle around the tree and get all of the stems there. Usually 2 or 3 feet high, and then go maybe 4 or 5 feet up, and then snip around that part, and then just pull off all of the vines around the tree and make sure you get all of them in that circle. And the ivy that's on the tree will die. Now, it won't look like the ivy is dying for quite a while because those leaves are very well preserved with their thick waxy cuticle. So it takes a really long time for them to look like they die. I will also say that it looks pretty horrible for quite a while because you just have this really crispy looking dead thing attached to your tree. I promise eventually it will get better and they'll decompose and fall off and you won't have to worry about it as being an eyesore. But it is gross to look at, I will admit that. And you're looking at maybe a year or more before you really see the evidence of the ivy dying in that instance. Of course, that still leaves the stuff that's on the ground. And my favorite way to deal with these on the ground, if you're at your home and you have an edger, is you can use an edging tool to just cut along a strip. So you make 2 cuts with the edging tool, and then you grip the ivy and you yank it and you just rip it up because the roots aren't very strong. So if you grip it and rip it up, you can just pull it up and you can actually roll up the ivy and put it on a surface where it doesn't have access to the ground, like concrete, or you can put a tarp down and you can let it biodegrade, which will, I mean, again, it will take quite a while for it to biodegrade, but I assure you, the plants are dead. They're just taking their sweet time. And if you don't have an edging tool, you can use clippers or loppers. It just takes a while. It's definitely possible, but I tried out the edging method. We have an electric edging tool, and it is really cool how fast you can cut up the ivy mats and roll them up. It's super satisfying when you get it ripping out of the ground and you get your big rolls of ivy. So if you have the opportunity to do it, I highly recommend it. It's very cathartic. And with that, I think I'm ready for the next question / species.
Okay. One is actually one that's not on the list. It says it's lesser celandine. I hope I'm saying that right.
Yes.
And this attendee said that it's in their yard and it's gone by the end of the May. They tried pulling it and poisoned with little effect.
Yeah, so lesser celandine is a bit of a nightmare and it's very perplexing to control. So for those that aren't familiar, lesser celandine has spade-shaped leaves and yellow. It's in the buttercup family, so that it's a buttercup. And the reason why it's so hard to control is because it has these little tiny bulblets that it produces on its roots. And each of those little bulblets it can become a new plant. So digging it up is very difficult. If you have a small patch, it is technically possible to dig up that soil and then to sift through it and grab all the bulblets out of there. I've done it before. I do not recommend it. As far as herbicides are also not super effective on them because the bulblets oftentimes are loose in the soil and they've dropped off of the leaves and they are no longer connected to the plant. So even if you have a systemic herbicide running through the plants, you might kill the plant that produced all the bulblets and the babies, but the bulblets are just going to keep coming up year after year. And honestly, I don't have the greatest advice for controlling them. There are some herbicides that have some residual activity in the soil that could be a possible option, but oftentimes lesser celandine grows in places that are pretty wet, so you might have a wetland or something where you wouldn't want to be applying an herbicide without having the proper formulation, which requires having a license and a permit that typically most people aren't going to be going for. So if you have a huge amount of it, it might be pretty difficult to control and remove. If you have a smaller amount, you can try digging it up and getting the bulblets. Another option, although I will urge a lot of caution because this can be dangerous, you can dig up as much of the dirt and soil as you can and then pour boiling water where the plants were to try to cook and kill the bulblets. I have used this method successfully for killing Italian arum. We had a giant soup pot and we boiled up a bunch of water after making this huge cavity where the Italian arum was. And I believe we boiled 3 full pots of the water and just poured the boiling water into the hole to kill these. Now, I'm not recommending that you use the boiling water. I'm only saying it's possible because again, it's quite hazardous to be handling that much boiling water, but it is an option that you could try. But use every safety precaution known to humanity when handling that, because again, it is something to be concerned about. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that you have lesser celandine, and I hope that helped somewhat. They're definitely a perplexing plant, and in my experience, they can be controlled, but it requires persistence, and you have to look at the actual site conditions and tackle each patch of it separately based on what tool makes the most sense. Next species / question.
Yeah, actually, there is a couple requesting information about Italian arum. So,
Woof. So Italian arum is a horrible plant. Now it's beautiful. Don't get me wrong. They're gorgeous plants. They have that great dark green color with the variegations on the leaves, and they have those interesting berries that are orange. And these plants are super toxic. They have these calcium oxide crystals in their leaves that can be, if you're handling the plants a lot, they actually will come off and they can be very irritating to your lungs. And I cannot disrecommend them enough. If you are considering planting Italian Arum, please do not plant Italian Arum. If you have it and you're trying to control it, I would recommend the digging up as much dirt as possible, and then the boiling water method to try to boil and kill the little tubers. Don't even try using an herbicide. Professionals have been frantically trying to find a formulation that's effective. I have heard some preliminary results that are semi-promising, but nothing I would want to share yet. And if I recall correctly, they weren't herbicides that you could buy over the counter necessarily. So the digging and boiling water trick is probably your best bet for those. And I have been able to control it successfully using that. I have heard of people trying to sift the soil, and if you want to try that, you're welcome to it. I just urge patience for that approach because it's going to be a long process, and you're going to have new ones coming up. And please, when you're handling these plants, always wear gloves and long sleeves, and then wash your clothes and gloves after you're done, because these plants are poisonous, they're toxic, and while they're most likely won't cause any harm, you don't know. Your particular physiology may be particularly susceptible to the toxins that the plants produce, or you may come in contact with your pets who may be more susceptible. So I just recommend taking all precautions when you're handling poisonous plants. And there are surprisingly a lot of poisonous plants out there. So just take care, please. And I think I'm ready for the next question.
Okay, yeah, actually, I'll go ahead and give two. We have Spurge and Shiny Geranium.
All right. Okay. So I actually have these on the list, so that's fun. So Spurge, I assume Spurge Laurel, but we can go through the gamut because there's a number of Spurge species out there. So Spurge Laurel is another toxic plant, if you can believe it. I believe it's on the B list for the noxious species list here in Clark County. They have dark green evergreen leaves, and they kind of resemble a young rhododendron is how I would describe them. They have these dense whorls of leaves around their shoots as they're growing up, and their flowers are very small, and they're green, and they're not very noticeable. They're not really showy. I think it says it on here. I think they attract moths at night, so they release smells and things to attract nocturnal pollinators. So they don't need a showy flower. That's not their jam. So these guys are planted primarily in horticultural situations or for landscaping because they're very pretty. They look interesting. They're green all year, and they have those dark berries that are considered attractive by some. These plants, I believe they have like some toxic like latex when you break the stems. I've only encountered these a couple times. I know that there is a small population out at it's not Louisville Park. It's Lucia Falls, the park there, right on the border. We found some while we were doing a volunteer ivy pull out there, and we found a patch of the Spurge Laurel. So we ended up pulling the Spurge Laurel as well, and getting those plants out of there. It's not super common in the area, but you will see it, and you might see it in your neighbor's house. I have seen quite a few of the Spurges planted in Portland for some reason. They're very popular over there. I'm not quite sure why, but I see a lot of different spurge species planted. So it's one to keep an eye on. And for getting these dealt with, I recommend using a digging implement and just digging them out of the ground. It's difficult, but it's possible. And obviously, the younger the plants are, the easier it will be. And with all toxic plants, wear long sleeves, wear gloves, and take care while handling these plants because they are quite toxic. Moving on to Leafy Spurge, which is, I don't know what, I think the Spurge thing is more due to the toxicity and that toxic sap more than anything, because these are obviously quite different. They have those really kind of like long, narrow leaves, and their flowers, while still not super conspicuous, they're more of a yellow color, yellow green. They are more showy, and these were also planted as a landscaping plant, and they're really problematic because they can just go crazy and spread really quickly. And let's see and get some more pictures here. So these little, like when the flowers are young, they kind of have that little cup-like shape. And they have those really long lanceolate leaves that you can see. And they can get quite tall as they age. Oh yeah, and there's a picture there of that milky sap, the latex, which is quite toxic. And I believe that is why these plants have the Spurge common name, even though they are not closely related, at least some of them. A lot of them are euphorbias, but as you saw with the last Spurge Laurel is in a different genus entirely. So Oblong Spurge is pretty similar in that it has the similar kind of yellowish flower that's not super, I mean, it's showy, but it doesn't stand out that much. And their leaves are just larger. They're still fairly lanceolate, but they're not quite as narrow and pointed, and they have that really prominent mid vein that stands out more. And like the other spurges, they have that toxic milky sap that you want to be careful about. They just have really more robust leaves. Otherwise, they're pretty similar. And I have seen this one planted quite a bit. If you want to get rid of them, they can be dug up successfully. You just have to, again, be careful to avoid contact with them, and especially with the milky sap that gets exuded from cuts and wounds on the plants. I think that's all the spurges I have. Yes. All right. Next one.
Okay, yeah, the next was shiny geranium.
Oh yeah, shiny geranium. My apologies. I already forgot about that. Oh, it's probably in the geraniums. Wait, where did it go? I don't see. Aha, shiny geranium. There we go. Okay, so my understanding is we have 5 different geraniums in our area. 3 of them are, or maybe it's 6. There's quite a few. 3 of them, to my knowledge, are considered invasive. Shiny geranium's probably the worst. There's also Stinky Bob, which is also a geranium, and the other one is Crane's Bill or Crane's Foot. One of the, I can't remember which. They're either way. Those are like in as far as tiering them, shiny geranium's the worst. Then you got Stinky Bob. Then you have Crane's Bill. kind of further down. It's still problematic in areas, but I haven't seen it get nearly as bad. Shiny geranium is pretty distinctive in that just like as the name would imply, the leaves look shiny in most instances. They're quite shiny. It's really striking seeing them out in the woods where they typically grow. So these are really problematic in forest understories where they can completely outcompete everything on the understory, or a lot of the low-growing herbs or herbaceous plants that grow on the understory. So there's something to keep a lookout for. Other characteristics to look for is if you look on the leaves, the veins are basically flat and plain on the leaf surface. A lot of the other geranium species, those veins have like an indent, so they're not exactly plain on the leaf surface. And also they typically have hairs on them and such, whereas the shiny geraniums are very sparsely furry. Well, I shouldn't say furry, but they have little tiny hairs, but they're very few and far between. And I think I have a good picture of that. But the other big thing, which you've probably already noticed, is that they have like these really bright red stems, which is, they don't always have this characteristic, but I would say the vast majority of shiny geraniums will have that really bright coloration on the stems, which makes them really stand out. And then they have those little pink flowers. I think I have some more pictures here. Yeah. So geraniums typically have this, they'll have their flower, and then they have this structure underneath the flower. I won't go into more details with the botanical stuff because I don't want to bore people. And also, it's just a lot of weird, Latin words that people decided were cool. So these are the flowers. And you can really see on this picture down at the bottom that shiny characteristic. They really are amazing to see when you're walking around. You can spot them pretty quickly just by seeing the shine coming off the leaves. It's unfortunate how pervasive they are. They were a Class A species in Clark County, but they've been downgraded. I believe they have, or they're in the process of being downgraded to a Class B because they are so incredibly pervasive, and we've lost the fight against the. I mean, we're trying to control it, but it's not something that we've been successful with, and that's a story that you hear time and time again with land managers trying to combat this species, just because it's such a prolific spreader and seeder. Just like Stinky Bob is typically in slightly drier habitats, whereas shiny geranium likes the more of a moist forest understory setting. It's really problematic out at the Salmon Creek Greenway. There's a lot of it down there, and the county has been working on it forever, and it just seems that it's impossible to get a handle on because they keep coming back. So that's just one of them's the breaks sometimes with the invasive species control. You can't win them all, and shiny geranium is very good at evading control efforts. So do we want to move on to another species / question?
Yeah, have a question, which is, why is butterfly bush so bad? Everyone loves it, including butterflies.
All right, I got some slides here, and I have a horrible / great story about butterfly bush. I know that people love their butterfly bush, and I'm not in that camp, and I'm going to tell you why. So butterfly bush is incredibly problematic in riparian areas where it can take over stream banks and completely outcompete the native vegetation. It's now I know that there are, make sure I have both my hands in here, sterile varieties of butterfly bush. Those sterile varieties have a seed viability rate of 15 to 10%, which is still plenty to spread. They're not as bad I'll say, but I have seen them spreading. I had one particular landowner at a previous position, so none of you folks, that had butterfly bush in their yard, and I was driving past and I saw a butterfly bush just growing in the ditch right along the road near their home, and I was surprised because I knew that the variety that they had was the sterile variety, in quotes. I dealt with the ones that were in the ditch. They were quite small, and I just pulled them up. And I went and asked the landowner about it and let them know that, it is considered an invasive species. And I gave them some recommendations for other plants that they could plant in its stead because the plant's spreading. And then, of course, they told me that they had the sterile variety. And I was surprised because I was recommending that people plant the sterile variety at that point in time. And then I looked it up and found out that they're not really sterile, and they still spread just fine. And now moving on to the butterfly part. So it is true that invasive species do provide some level of resources to pollinators. I am not an expert on pollinators. I am a pollinator fan, and I know a bit about bumblebees, and I have enough background knowledge as far as the ecology and how pollinators interact with plants to be able to speak on this topic, but I couldn't give you specifics necessarily. So what typically happens with invasive plants that provide nectar resources is that the vast majority of the pollinators that go and visit those plants are generalist species, or they actually can sometimes also be good resources in general from a food standpoint. The problem is that there is a co-evolution. I talked about this a bit before, but where you have a situation where you'll have a caterpillar that is specifically adapted to eating a particular plant. A great example of this is the monarch butterfly and milkweeds. So milkweeds have a toxic sap that the monarch butterfly larvae are actually able to eat and sequester into their tissues, which makes them toxic, so they're not going to be eaten by birds. So it's a 2-for-1 special there. They're almost able to exclusively feed on these plants, and they don't have to worry about being eaten. Now, these relationships are very specific. So if you bring something like a butterfly bush into an area, that will provide, if it does provide, it probably provides some level of nectar resources, but it's not a nesting site. So there's no butterflies that can lay their eggs on it, and you're basically breaking that chain in the ecosystem. So you're only providing one part of the picture of the resources. So if there aren't native plants nearby that they can utilize for nesting sites, you're still going to see a drop in the pollinators around, or you're going to see things like honeybees, which are not native, as it turns out. Bumblebees are, but honeybees are not. So they actually compete with our native pollinators and make it harder for them to persist in the environment. And a lot of times with things like butterfly bush, you're going to be providing a lot of resources for honeybees and other. You're probably going to get some butterflies on them, but I would recommend planting a ceanothus. They are native to our area. They provide very similar flowers, but they're more blue. Sorry about that. And they smell amazing. And they're great for the environment. So I highly recommend those as an alternative to butterfly bush. So there's almost always a native species that's really similar in aesthetic values that you can plant instead of an exotic species. And I always point people towards the natives just because you're guaranteed to be providing the most possible ecological resources if you go that route. I think that's about it for butterfly bush. I guess we can do a little bit of ID in case you're not familiar. They have these big flower clusters of kind of purpley flowers, and they have it's not really easy to see in that past picture, but this one, it has a kind of a grayish hue because they're a little fuzzy, and that coloration is pretty distinctive. And I often see little seedlings of these out while we're on our restoration projects because they've spread from other areas, and we just pull them up as we see them because they will cause problems over time. So I definitely recommend if you're out looking for a showy shrub to plant something like ceanothus, or mock orange is a good choice. Red flowering currant is native to our area. Yellow flowering currant also native to our area. And fun fact with yellow flowering currant is they produce little orange currant berries. They're actually quite tasty and very much edible. I recommend them highly. That's my spiel on butterfly bush. So I'm sorry if that's not what you wanted to hear, but I'm not going to come after you for having one in your yard. But I do recommend that when you go to either replace it, or if you're planting, if you have another space for a flowering shrub, that you just choose a native species because you'll be doing the ecosystem more of a favor. And they typically require less control or less intervention. They don't need irrigation. They don't need to have pesticides or fertilizers applied to them because they are well adapted to our area. Um, so we're going to move on to the next species.
Okay. Actually, there's a couple questions that are similar, and they're wondering about any restrictions or efforts to get nurseries or plant stores from selling invasives.
So yes, there are. They aren't. So nurseries generally are not allowed to sell noxious weeds. It's difficult to police, and I'm not really sure exactly who is responsible for doing that. My and what I do is I just recommend the native plants because then you're guaranteed not to be planting an invasive species. And problematically, oftentimes you can find a brand new, like really cool looking plant at the nursery, and it's new to the area, nobody has it, and you're like, I'm the first person in my neighborhood to have this plant, but you don't know if that plant is going to be invasive. Like there's no telling what it's going to do out in the environment and if it's going to spread and start causing problems. So oftentimes plants will be introduced to an area and they don't really do anything for the longest time. They just grow where you plant them, and you're like, oh, this is great. The thing is, if they're able to cross-pollinate with each other and mix up their genome, they might hit the jackpot and find the super strain of this species that is invasive and is perfectly suited for the environment, and then they can go ballistic and absolutely spread like wildfire, and that happens all the time. So if you want to do yourself a favor, check out the native plant nurseries in our area and just buy native plants for your landscaping. I'm not saying you have to do that for your food crops, like get your tomatoes, get your zucchinis, but also get your big leaf maples and your red osier dogwoods and your red flying currants and all the beautiful native species from our area, because most people aren't using them in their landscaping, so you can actually have a really unique looking yard. People always comment on our front yard and how amazing it looks with all the different plants and everything, and they're not aware that all of the plants are from our local area. And we do a little bit of seed collecting, and we also bought some plants from a local native plant nursery, and it's been really rewarding to see all of the native pollinators visiting We had a sphinx moth come. We've had a number of different bumblebees, including the largest bumblebee species in North America. It's Bombus Nevodensis, and their queens are absolutely massive. They are, now don't confuse them with murder hornets, but they can get, I would say, about this big, maybe a little bit bigger, and that's just their body. They are absolutely massive bees, and they make a really loud buzzing sound when they're flying around. It's just like they're like, it's pretty fun because a lot of times you can hear them before you can see them because they're just loud, noisy bombers running around pollinating plants. So I hope that answered the question. I got a little bit off topic there, but I do like my native plants and will always hawk them when given the opportunity.
Okay. Next species is knapweed.
Oh geez, knapweed is quite problematic, and there's a lot of different knapweed species out there, and I believe you're only treating a couple in this presentation. Let me see if I can find that. I know there's some in here. Is it by R? No. Oh, there it is. Russian knapweed. We got that one. Well, there's a lot of different knapweeds, and Russian knapweed, I put it in here mostly because it is very uncommon, and it's one to look out for. But we have a lot of knapweeds in our area. There's spotted knapweed, there's meadow knapweed, there is diffuse knapweed, and there are hybrid crosses between these knapweeds. One of the biggest problems with the knapweeds is that they are supposedly, I'm not entirely sure if this is accurate, but I've heard that they are very toxic and carcinogenic. And I know that we were told that we had to wear gloves whenever pulling up these plants when we were working with them with the Forest Service. Let me see if I can move here. So the big distinctive thing with the knapweeds is that if you look right below the flower there, they have a kind of this papery bract at the base of the flower, and those are very distinctive and often used as a diagnostic characteristic, as each of them are a little different from species to species, and it's a really good way to identify them. With Russian knapweed, the big thing to look for is that the bracts have this really extended papery bit at the end that's almost translucent. And even as the plants age, those bracts stay pretty green, which is fairly unusual. Most of the other species that we have in our area, which are all invasive, by the way, they start to get more of a yellowish coloration. And we also have some that have black spots on them, and those are spotted knapweed. So pretty easy to figure out in that regard. For the Russian knapweed, they have these really irregular leaf shapes they have really deep lobes, and they're irregularly toothed. So they're quite bizarre looking for a plant. Usually plants have pretty uniform leaf structures. I know there's plenty of examples of ones that don't, but for knapweeds, this one is quite weird, and it's a good way to identify these suckers if you see them out there. More commonly, you'll probably be seeing something like meadow knapweed, and those are quite similar looking, but their leaves are quite a bit larger, and the plants are quite a bit larger than the Russian knapweed that we're looking at here. And if you do see knapweeds, I recommend wearing gloves, and they can be dug up with some effort. depending on the size. If they're smaller and the soil's moist, sometimes you can pull them up. But they have a root structure called a root crown, and you need to make sure you grab that, because if you leave it in the soil or parts of it in the soil, it will regrow from those. And mowing is also not effective on knapweed. I have seen knapweed that was 1.5 inches tall that was mowed, and it had flowers, and it was flowering like nothing was wrong. They really don't care. They will keep growing. So your best bet is to dig up that root crown and haul them out and throw them away. And that's about all I got on the knapweeds.
Okay. The next is flowering rush.
Oh, yes. So flowering rush is, I believe I have it in here. It's really problematic in the Columbia River Gorge, especially as you go further east. There it is. So this plant is very difficult to control because it grows submerged, and it has those really kind of, let me see if I have a better picture of the leaves here. It has those triangular leaves that there's not a lot of structure to them. So a lot of times, a lot of the plant parts are submerged, and herbicides aren't really a good approach because of this. What a lot of land managers have been doing, and I believe the Army of Corps of Engineers has been trying to tackle the flowering rush problem, is they've been taking divers out with this special suction rig, and they go and they'll actually be digging up the roots and everything, and then they have the suction rig that's pulling up any root fragments and everything and just sucking it all up into this machine, and then they're going to throw all that plant debris away so they can't spread and go downstream. I don't really know if this is something we're going to be able to address effectively, and if you are a private landowner that has it on your property, your options are pretty limited. If it's in a pond situation and the area it's covering isn't huge, you could look into a weed mat after cutting back as much of the above ground and above water material as you could. It may be possible to cover and smother it, although I know that they've tried that in larger areas and situations, and they've seemed to be able to grow out from under them eventually. But it would at least be a start, and that would be the approach I would recommend if you were trying to control flowering rush. But we don't really have much that looks like this in our area that's native. It's a pretty unique species. So if you see something with these kind of pink, red flowers that's coming and growing out of the water, there's a good chance that you're looking at flowering rush. And it would be a good thing to report if you do find something on the EdMaps app. And speaking of which, I think let's do one more question, and then let's move on to how we can report invasive species as we find them out in the world.
Okay. Let's see here. We have maybe a couple quicker questions. One was just, will these slides be available? And then one was, what should I do with invasives that I dig up? Do I put them in a compost bin, burn them, put them in the garbage?
So for most invasive species that you're digging up, you could burn them, but do be aware that if they're toxic, you do not want to be breathing in what they're putting out. If you can't do that, which I mean, I know it probably feels terrible to do this, but you can't. I would recommend putting them in the trash. Don't compost any invasive species because it's likely that they can spread and grow out of your compost bin, and you'll just spread it around all of your property. It's very common for that to happen. And as for these slides, I believe I can make these available after this. I can package this up as a PDF because it is far too large to send as an email attachment as a PowerPoint. I believe it's 90 megabytes in size. So I'll package it up in a PDF and I'll shoot that out to Marlene. And I think if you folks can make that available, that would be excellent.
Yeah, that'd be no problem.
Great. Well, let us move on to let's see here. Final bit here. I'm going to plug EdMaps, and I will say I have no connection to EdMaps. It is it's basically a national invasive species reporting and application. So like on your for smart devices, and it's also a database. It was developed by the University of Georgia as a clearinghouse for both professionals and amateurs to report sightings of invasive species. And it's a really great platform because when you put in those reports, people so anyone who does invasive species control in the area that signs up for alerts will get an alert when you put in a report, so they can check it and help you with identification. And then if it's something that they can deal with and treat, they will go out and take care of it for you. And it's a really great tool for catching things early. I know with there was a situation where somebody put in a sighting for a policeman's helmet, and Clark County Vegetation Management saw that and was like, whoa, we don't see this in Clark County. We need to jump on it. So they went out and immediately went to the area, pulled up and treated all the plants, and then checked around, did surveys, and then notified other land managers in the area saying, hey, we had this sighting of this plant, and it's something that we should be on the lookout for, which was a great example of the power of this tool, because oftentimes really the biggest limiting factor for catching new invasive species is just that we don't see them because there's so much land to cover. And really, if people drive by it every day and they don't really know what the plants are, they don't pay attention to the plants around them, they're not going to know that it's weird or unusual. They're gonna look at those and be like, wow, those are pretty pink flowers, not knowing that they're actually highly invasive and problematic, especially in riparian areas. So this is a great way to take the plant knowledge in your hobby of growing and loving plants and putting it to good use. And it's super easy to do. I know it's one more app to put on your phone. I don't know if you folks are like me, but I feel like I have way too many on there, and I would love to purge as many as I could. But EdMaps is a great tool, and I highly recommend it. And I'd say it's worthwhile because it can help you with identification and also reporting invasive species. So this is just a real quick overview. I would have loved to do a live demonstration by mirroring my device, but I have not been able to get it to work well, and I didn't want to chance it glitching out and disconnecting. So we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. So I apologize. And this is more for demonstration purposes and just to show how easy it is to do. So this is the app on Android. I think the one on Apple is slightly different, but it should work pretty much the same way. So all you have to do is you sign in, and after you sign in the first time on your device, you don't have to do it again. It'll remember you, and you just open it and you get going with your reporting. So you sign in, then you go up to the new sighting button, you click on that, and then from there you just hit your you choose your subject, and your species list can be tailored to your area. And I was told that the best species list to use for Washington right now is actually the Oregon one, because the Washington one is missing some key species, and they're working on fixing it, but it's proving to be somewhat problematic. So in the interim, they're recommending to use the Oregon list, and you'll get that once you set up the app on your phone. It'll ask you which species list you want to download. So in this example, I have the Oregon list downloaded. So after you hit the new sighting, you hit the subject, and you just go down to the little hourglass there at the bottom to do a search. And then it will have pictures when relevant, or it'll also have the names, but you can just type in what you're looking for. So once you get your species selected, you can go and you can take pictures and attach those pictures to the sighting. And once you click on the images button, it'll give you the option to either choose a picture you've already taken or take one then and there and attach those to your report. So if you have a well, okay, there's a typo here. It says useful for sightings on public land. This is actually for when you are on private land. If you spot something on private land, you can hide exact location and then it won't put the exact location there, which is nice. I mean, it's not really very, it's not very appropriate to put out, like if somebody has an invasive species on their property, it's just poor form to call them out on it necessarily. I would, if you click on that, it'll hide the exact location, and then only land managers can see that, and then they can offer assistance to the landowner with that if it's something that is really problematic and needs to be dealt with. For example, if they had kudzu on their property. Which, fun fact, kudzu, there's two popular, I think there's 2 or 3 populations that were found. I think it was around 2010, somewhere in that time frame. There was a couple plants found in Portland and one found in Vancouver. And it was somebody out in the community, a citizen scientist, maybe like you, that saw the kudzu and reported it. And people came out and got rid of the kudzu and killed it before it could spread and take over. And if you've ever been out to the southeastern part of the U.S., you've probably seen what kudzu can do. It makes ivy look like a joke. It will take over everything. It grows over absolutely every square inch of available space and will completely overtop and kill trees. It will grow over everything that exists. I went to go visit my dad down in Florida, and on the way back from the airport, it was a 10-mile stretch of highway, and the only plant I could see was kudzu. It was ridiculous. I've never seen an invasive species this bad before. It just covered absolutely every square inch of space that was available. Trees, buildings, just you name it, it was covering it. So getting that and controlling it was an amazing success story. And one of the reasons why I think it's really vital to get people out in the community interested in invasive species and just identifying and letting people know, hey, I saw this thing. So the last thing there on the list is just surveying time, and you just say how long you spent in the area. This one's not super important. You just put how long you were there, just so the land manager that would come and check up on it knows how long you were spending in the area looking. The next thing is your infestation status. So positive would be that you see the plants. Treated would be if, for example, let's say you saw like 4 garlic mustard plants popping up, and you pulled them up and you put them in the trash like you're supposed to. You could say that you treated them then and there. And then a negative would be if you came back the next year after pulling the garlic mustard and didn't find any garlic mustard in that same spot. For the habitat, just use your best judgment. There's a lot of options in there. Like if you're along a trail as a common designation, or a roadway. If you're along a stream, that would be a riparian area, that kind of thing. I'm not actually going to give you a detailed explanation, but if you ask a question about it at the end here, if we have time, I will try to answer it to the best of my ability. And as for the density, it's basically just asking the percent area that is covered with the weed that you're reporting on. So because you already put in the how much space it is, and just use your best guess. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're just looking for an idea of how much is there. And if it's even vaguely in the ballpark, then you're good. Like, you know, if you put 500 square feet for a small patch, that's great. It's not that big of a deal. If you put that there's several acres, then we'll know that there's a real problem, and we're gonna have to send in whatever the invasive species equivalent is for the Navy SEALs. And I don't know what that is. My clearance level isn't that high yet. That's all I have for the EdMap stuff. I'm sure we have some more questions, or maybe we don't. Oh, too far. I'd be happy to answer any more questions that folks have, or hit any species that we didn't have time for.
Yeah, there are some more. One is Buttercup. How do you stop it from spreading? It's really hard to pull out.
Yes. So I assume you're talking about creeping buttercup, and I can definitely empathize with you on that one. They're very difficult to control. In my experience, the buttercup typically takes over the entire area that it's growing in. And my recommendation for control, if it's possible and it makes sense for you, I would try cover it. I would cover it with some type of sheeting. I do not recommend weed fabric or cloth, because it typically it'll be a barrier for a while, but eventually plants will be able to grow up through it, and their roots will then get enmeshed in the fabric, and it's very difficult to pull them out without doing a lot of damage to the fabric. So for smaller areas, if you can tolerate a scorched earth approach, you can cover areas after cutting all of the vegetation you can off, hopefully at ground level or as low as you can get. You can put plastic over it. There's different schools of thought regarding using black plastic or clear plastic. I think the minimum thickness I would go with is 3 mils, and if you can get it, I would go up to 6 mils thickness for the plastic, because it is going to get a lot of abuse with the sun. But this will A, starve the plants of sunlight, or B, if you're using the clear plastic, it will cook them. It's a process called solarization. It's not the best approach in that it will kill everything that's under there. Typically, B, with these buttercups, you might have them spreading beyond the confines of the plastics. You'll have to keep an eye out for that. And it also will kill a lot of the soil bacteria and the fungi in the soil, which can be beneficial. So if you take this approach, when you're rehabilitating the soil afterwards, be sure to use like a really rich compost and apply it in those areas to help reintroduce those bacteria, because they're really beneficial for plants, and they provide a lot of services and get they basically break down things in the soil, and they provide a lot of benefits and nutrients that the plants can use. And you'd be surprised at how few things can tolerate those really nasty solarized soils. Typically they're weeds. So definitely recommend getting the soil nutrients back up after doing that. Any others?
Actually, I have a question here. One is, just for the purposes of IDing weeds in your yard for which you don't know the names, is there a website that you can recommend? I have looked at various different ones, but sometimes the pictures aren't clear enough for me to identify, or they're in stages that don't match the photos displayed.
Yeah, so plant identification is a rabbit hole that you can go down, and depending on how much effort you want to put into it. As far as applications that you could use, I would recommend the EdMaps app is pretty good. If you want to go more into plant ID outside of just invasive species, and you don't mind spending money on an app, which I know is sacrilegious to many people, but there is the Oregon Flora app, I believe it's called, which is quite relevant for our area, because I don't know if y'all know, but Oregon is just right across the Columbia there, and then you got Oregon. So most of the plants are relevant to our area. And the way that the app works is really neat, in that you put in characteristics of the plant you're looking at, and then it'll keep culling the list, and it will only show you plants that meet those characteristics, and you just keep putting in those characteristics until you narrow it down, and it has pictures and information. If you're looking for photos, a website that's good but not great, because it's California based, but a lot of the plants that they have down in California we have up here, so it's not that irrelevant, is called Cal Photos. And they have the best repository for native plant photos that I've seen, and I highly recommend it. If you get to a possible plant ID and you want to verify it, they have so many great photos on there, and a lot of them are free use, and they're typically very high quality. So it's a good resource for plant ID. And just getting pictures of plants in general. If you're needing a particular life stage of a plant, typically they have all of them on that website.
Okay, I think we just have time for maybe one more. And the next one on the list is Bishop Weed.
Oh, geez. I'm not sure if I've dealt with Bishop Weed. I'm trying to think. I might have seen it once, but I don't have much experience with it, honestly. And I would not be able to give much information on that, so I apologize. But that's one species that's not in my wheelhouse. I've spent most of my career working on riparian plants and plants that grow along waterways. So I don't have a good grasp on the plants that spread in pasture lands as much. I did do some of that work, but there's just so many different species that can pop up that it's definitely challenging to know them all. So I'm sorry about that, but that's one I don't know. And there is, before we part, I just want to plug our new program that uses EdMaps and people's ID skills and combines them into a remote volunteer experience that can be whatever you want it to be. We call it Weed Watchers, and basically it's a little bit more structured than just giving you EdMaps and plant ID skills and letting you run wild. We do these things called bio blitzes, where we'll have little mini competitions where you can whoever submits the most invasive species reports to EdMaps within a given period of time, and I think we're going to do it over like weekends. We'll have prizes, things like Chico bags. We might be able to do T-shirts in the future, but don't hold me to that. I'm working on it, but I don't know if we're going to be able to make that fly. But we also will be giving people that sign up a weed pick and a bunch of more information, like an invasive species ID packet. It's just a PDF with a bunch of different invasive species from our area and identification characteristics. And then you'll have a direct line to me and some other folks that are very good identifying invasive species. So if you want help IDing a plant, you can send pictures in to me. Please note that if you don't have flowers or reproductive structures, I may have some difficulty because there's a lot of plants that look very similar when you just have the leaves. So the more characteristics you can send with your photos, the more likely I can identify those for you. And if you have any other questions that we didn't get to in this presentation, you are more than welcome to call or email me. The number listed here is my work cell phone number. And then bmead@clarkpud.com. Feel free to send any plant questions you have, plant ID, how do I deal with this particular weed. This is what I do and I really enjoy it. I probably won't be able to help you necessarily deal with the weed itself unless you have something in Salmon Creek watershed along a riparian area and it's considered an invasive species, typically class A and B. I can't help people with that. I have a grant active for those. And if you have knotweed in Salmon Creek watershed or East Fork watershed, then I can come out and help you take care of that as well, because it's not something that can be dealt with by a landowner if it's near a waterway, which it typically grows near, which is why we decided that it was worthwhile to create a program specifically targeting riparian invasive species, since most landowners can't deal with those plants. So that's all I have today. I really appreciate everybody coming and spending this afternoon with us, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, and just want to
Thank you
remind
very
everyone.
much, Brad and Elliot. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll send out that link to the recording, and so you'll receive a follow-up email soon. So thanks again, Brad.
everybody.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.